This is not a solicitation to buy or sell any security ever. This is not advice. The results here are provided for general information purposes as a convenience to you, the viewers. The materials are not a substitute for obtaining professional advice from a qualified person, firm, or corporation. So yeah, let's talk about inflation, the stuff impacting it, but the short version. So first of all, I think it's probably most important to understand the Fed's stance. So there is someone named Neil Kashkari, who is a very vocal CEO of the Minneapolis Fed. So he said a lot of policy tightening still has to work its way through the economy. I think that's fair. Then he says he does see a risk of overshooting. So essentially too much interest rate hiking or too quickly. But the most important thing is he says he sees almost no evidence that inflation has peaked. And that's what I want to focus on. So let's just start with that. There are many, many measures of inflation. There's actually 6 of them. So CPI, PCE, and PPI. CPI is the one you see in the news. It's the Consumer Price Index. PPI is the Producer's Price Index. So you could say PPI is a bit of a leading indicator and CPI is a lagging indicator, right? Producer prices end up filtering into consumer prices for better or worse. PCE, the one in the middle, is the Personal Consumption Expenditure. It actually comes from the GDP report, and it actually shows what people are spending money on, and that's why it's generally a preferred measure of inflation. So CPI is a basket of goods, which they don't really change that much, and I'll give you an obtuse example of why PCE is probably better than CPI. Let's just pretend everything was normal with inflation, but bread, for some reason, went to $17 million a loaf. I don't know, just $17 million a loaf. Okay, well, no one would be buying bread. And instead, we'd be buying other stuff, rice crackers, I don't know, wheat thins, I don't know, right? So CPI would explode to unimaginable numbers. PCE actually wouldn't change because PCE reflects substitutes. Something becomes too expensive, we as consumers go to something that's a substitute. So PCE is a better measure of what people are dealing with in their lives. Not that CPI is not valuable. I didn't say that. Also, CPI is survey data, right? Whereas PCE is actually from the GDP report. That's why it takes longer to get PCE. Then we have the core of all threes. So the core of all of these is the same thing, but it takes out food and energy. People tend to look at that because food and energy tend to be driven by commodity prices like wheat or fertilizer or palm oil. And then on the energy side, obviously oil, jet fuel, things like that. So if you want to get a picture of like, is inflation getting better or worse, people tend to look at core more closely. Maybe most importantly is the Fed uses core PCE as the measure through which to determine if we have real negative or positive rates. Okay, I'll explain what that means later, but core PCE is the number. So CPI right now is at 8.3%, and if the Fed wants positive real Fed funds rate, that means it has to go above 8.3%, but that's not what the Fed uses. The Fed uses the core PCE deflator. Right now, that's still high. It's 4.9%, but it's not 8.3%. And by the way, that's why the market is looking at Fed funds rate going to about 4.9%, if you're wondering. Okay. So let's start with the top 3, CPI, PCE, and PPI, okay? Here's a chart of inflation. This is CPI. This is the one that the news gets, okay? I'm not going to make a whole lot of comments about it. I'll just let you guys ingest it. The next one is PCE that I talked about, and here it is. This is, I'm not going to make a lot of comments. Here it is. Okay. And then the last one is PPI, which is it's like CPI, but for producers, and here's that. Okay, so why don't you guys just take, I don't know, like to yourselves or out loud, if you're the kind of people who like to talk out loud, just like, how would you describe CPI, PCE, and PPI charts I've shown you? Like just, what would you say? You don't have to type it in. Just I want you to form an opinion for yourself, okay? Because if you form an opinion for yourself, then you can challenge my opinion. Okay. So this is what Neil Kashkari said, right? No evidence that inflation has peaked. That doesn't comport to reality with me. There is evidence that inflation has peaked. That's a peak, it's down. That's a peak, it's down. That's a peak, it's down. Doesn't mean it has peaked. I just don't understand when he says there's no evidence that it has peaked. There's quite a bit of evidence. And in fact, I'm going to show you nearly 50 data points of evidence. Now let's go to the core measures, because these are much more closely related to predictable inflation. Here's core CPI. Here's core PCE, and here is core PPI. Remember that the producer's price index is usually considered a leading indicator relative to the other ones because producer prices filter their way into end prices. And again, this is what Neil Kashkari thinks. I want you guys to make it, what do you think about all three? I would really take all three of them together if I had to really focus on what I'd focus on core PCE. Just say out loud what you think about that. In my opinion, it doesn't comport. There's no evidence that inflation has peaked. Is it tenuous with core CPI? Yeah. Does core PPI look better than the rest? Yeah. I don't understand no evidence that inflation has peaked. That's not right. To me, that's my opinion. All right, so what makes up CPI? So you guys can actually go, you don't need Twitter, right? You can go to the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's sometimes referred to in shorthand as BLS, okay? And you can just go to the latest CPI report. This is the one from August 2022. The consumer price index for all urban customers rose 0.1% in August on a seasonally adjusted basis, blah, 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 and 8.3% if you take it annually. That's this number, 8.3%. Okay, so you guys can do this on your own. You don't need me. You don't need Twitter. You can read it. The report's actually quite legible. It doesn't have a lot of jargon. Okay. Oh, so what makes up core CPI, right? So CPI, we know CPI has food and energy plus core CPI. So let's talk about core CPI. Okay, so you guys can do, you don't need me for this either. You guys can do a Google search and you can use CoreLogic. CoreLogic tells us that rent comprises 40% of the core CPI price index. 40% of the measurement of inflation that people, this or PCE, core PCE, people think is kind of the real measure of inflation. 40%, nearly half of it is rent. There's various measures of rent, by the way. It's not just one measure of rent. One of them is called the owner's equivalent rent. So sometimes you'll see on Twitter things OER. Okay, so the owner's equivalent rent of primary residence is meant to capture just the implicit value of services that homeowners consume from their own homes. That means nothing. Here's what it means. It is calculated using a subset of the same rental data as the CPI. And what they do is they survey homeowners and they say, how much could you rent your home out for rent? It's complete survey data. It's not actual data. Okay? That's what owner's equivalent rent is. So here are some headlines. This is from the Wall Street Journal. Rents drop for the first time in 2 years after climbing to records nationwide. Rents declined on a monthly basis in August. We're not even in September. We haven't even done September yet, amid new apartment construction and weaker consumer sentiment. This is the link to the article. I always send the slides to you guys so you don't have to trust me on these headlines like I made them up. You just click on the link. But I'm going to show you some charts, okay? So there's various places that do apartments. One is Apartment List. You can see the radical change month over month in rents in 2021. It was less radical in 2022, but it was on top of 2021. And here's that. Here's what it's saying in September. Down. Not slower inflation. This slower inflation is called disinflation. This is actually deflation. Here is the same data from CoreLogic. CoreLogic is where we got the definition. We don't have to go. This is like low tier, high tier, rich people, poor people, whatever. Okay, it's all lower. That this is the rate of inflation. So if it's showing disinflation, then the month over month rates must be coming down. And then this is from Realtor.com. So that, you could also use Zillow if you want. I don't know. I'm trying to show you that I'm not picking one source. And the black line is the median rent change year over year, right? So it's still positive. The red line is median rent. And if the median rent turns down, that means month over month it's negative. So Apartment List says it's negative. CoreLogic says it's negative. Realtor.com says it's negative. The Wall Street Journal article, I believe, was based on Zillow. So all four places we look at for rent are down. So again, Neil Kashkari says there's no evidence that inflation has peaked. I showed you with CPI, PCE, PPI, core CPI, core PCE, and core PPI. Now I'm showing you the single largest factor of core CPI. It just doesn't comport with reality. I'm not telling you that it's good. I'm not telling you that we won't go peak again. I won't tell you that these bars won't turn back. I'm not saying that. But to say that there's no evidence or almost no evidence that inflation has peaked just doesn't comport with reality. In fact, I would say, show me some evidence that it has not peaked. Actually, I can't even find that. Right? So show me some evidence that it's going higher. All right. So, there was an article from CNBC just yesterday, which says apartment demand has unexpectedly fell during its busiest season. So right now is the busiest season for apartments. So it's supposed to be going up. And what we were hoping for is that it would go up just less than we thought. And CNBC's went out. This is not the Wall Street Journal article. This is not a CNBC article. And they're saying, actually, people are kind of stunned. Rents should not be going down right now. This is peak season. So we have the Wall Street Journal, we have CNBC, we have apartmentlist.com, we have CoreLogic, and we have realtor.com. So there's 5 different sources that show that we have peaked. And not only are we seeing disinflation, we're seeing deflation. That doesn't comport with me that we've no evidence that inflation has peaked. I just don't understand what he's saying. And I don't mean that to be an asshole. I mean, I actually don't understand. Like if you were to say, this in my hand is a pizza, I say, okay, pizza. They say, now what is this called? I said, it's called pizza. They said, no, it's not pizza. It's a baseball. I said, I don't understand. You just said it was pizza. Okay. So I don't get it. The Fed is focused most seriously, though. They talk about home prices, which go into owner's equivalent rent, but they really talk about wages. Okay. So there's a bunch of derivatives of wages, like how many people are working, how many people are quitting, how many jobs are getting cut. And what it just comes down to is wages. But let's use the derivative data. Let's try to find what Neil Kashkari is talking about. Okay. So wage inflation is a function of 2 things. It's the number of job openings and it's the workers available. So just to make that just point, let's say there's 1,000 job openings in the country, but there's only 100 workers. And let's say all 1,000 jobs are the same job. The job is to stand in a corner and hammer the same nail. It's the exact same job. And there's 1,000 companies that want someone to hammer that same nail. But there's only 100 people available. We got to get that nail knocked in 1,000 different places. So how do you get people to get hired? Well, you have to offer them more money, right? That's the function of wage inflation without making it complicated. So in order to get to Neil Kashkari's conclusion that there's nearly no evidence, we need to see job openings growing. We need to see the number of workers available shrinking. We need to see the number of people quitting dropping. We need to see the number of jobs so future job cuts reduced. Right? People are saying we're going to cut jobs. So let's just start. Okay, here's job openings. Those are job openings. Are they above where they should be? Yeah, of course they are. Of course they are. That's healthy. Is there no evidence of a change? I really don't understand. In fact, last month, this report just came out about a week ago. Last month, there were 1 million fewer job openings. And I want you guys to understand that when things turn for the economy, for example, this way, when it's not driven by government stimulus, right, this down and this up happen quickly, when it's just sort of the normal things, this is a more than $20 trillion economy with a T. When things start going in a direction, they don't stop going in that direction for a while, okay? So this can very quickly turn from, cool, we're cooling off, to a total disaster within 5 months, okay? But I'm not saying that. That's not my argument. I'm saying Neil Kashkari says that he sees no or almost no evidence. That doesn't comport with that to me. But we don't really have to do that. We can look at job cuts. Okay, if companies aren't cutting jobs, then this thing maybe will reverse. Well, there's something called the Challenger Report. It's the name of a company. It's not like a cool name, like I'm challenging you. So these are job cuts. Companies are cutting, the trend, in my opinion, is higher. Companies are cutting more jobs. It's translating into fewer job openings, right? So job openings are a function of 2 things, job cuts. That's one thing, but it's also just people saying, hey, we're not hiring. Okay, so that's the first thing. Remember I said it's function 2 things, job openings. So if there are more jobs getting cut and fewer openings, then I feel like that's part 1 of wage inflation. Part 2 is workers available. This is the prime age labor participation rate. So it's 25 to 54-year-olds. We can see where it was pre-COVID, was 83.1. See where it dropped. Just keep in mind that this is a crazy scale, right? It's 80 to 83.5. So everything looks huge and it's not that big. And this is the trajectory. We just got the non-farm payrolls report. Sometimes you'll see it shortened as NFP. We'll talk about it. It was a little disappointing. Went from 82.8 to 82. If you're wondering what that is, 82.8 to 82.7. This number is 83.1. So we're still very close, but yeah, it was disappointing. We were hoping it was 82.8, maybe we'll go to 82.9, but it's just in general, is there no evidence that the number of workers available is changing? I don't see that there's no, I would say, I don't see any evidence to what he's talking about, right? So he said, job openings and workers available. Job openings are crashing. Well, sorry, they're lower. Workers available is growing in general. Keep in mind in this trend line, there were dips, right? It's normal. This is a very bouncy line. Okay, then we can just look to the non-farm payrolls report, right? Which is actual number of jobs, non-farm jobs taken, right? So from July to August, how many new jobs were taken? How many more employed people were there? Well, here's the non-farm payrolls report. Okay. I don't know. Like, to me, there's some weird numbers here, that kind of the bars, but like this is the lowest number since, gosh, I think April of 2021. I don't know. Like, this doesn't, there's no evidence, there's almost no evidence that inflation is peak. I don't really know what he's talking about. There are fewer jobs available. There are more job cuts coming. There are more people in the workforce, and the number of jobs, new people employed month over month, is basically crashing. It doesn't comport with reality. And finally, none of this data matters, right? You can actually throw all of this data about jobs up, because it's all just, these are all just derivatives of what, the only thing that matters is are wages coming down. I can spin an interesting tale about fewer job openings and more job cuts and blah, blah, blah. Okay, but are wages coming down? Well, here's a picture of wage inflation. Sorry. This is year over year wage inflation. Okay, we just got this from the non-farm payrolls report, right? The lowest since December of 2021 and the lowest since a long time before that. I don't know, like, again, I don't know, almost no evidence that inflation has peaked. Does that mean this movement down, he thinks we're going to go back over 5.6? Because that would mean that we break the peak, right? I don't really understand. Also, one thing I want to point out, and you're going to see where I'm going with this, CPI, the rate of inflation as measured by CPI, is 8.3%. So I just want you guys, like, slowly, some of you aren't, like, it's hard for you to hold numbers in your head. So just 8.3. And let's say, hey, I don't want to pay attention to food and energy because we're talking about wages. Okay, so it's 6.3. 6.3 is core CPI. 6.3. Core inflation is 6.3. 6.3. Okay. Wage inflation is 5. So core CPI is 6.3. Wage inflation is 5. CPI and core CPI are nothing more than an average. It's a weighted average. It doesn't matter. An average of a bunch of numbers: cost of bread, cost of rent, wages, cars, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so you just take a whole bunch of numbers and you take their average, and the average happens to have a weight. Doesn't matter. If wage inflation is 5%, which it is, and if core CPI, that's year over year, and if core CPI is 6.3% year over year, which it is a mathematical tautology, right? It is an unbreakable truth, which is defined by the very nature of itself. That's what a tautology is. It is a tautology that wage inflation at 5% is a drag. It's taking inflation down if inflation is at 6.3%, right? The number 5, when averaged with a whole bunch of other numbers that average 6.3, takes the number down. In other words, if we just pretended wage inflation wasn't in core CPI, we just didn't care about wages, inflation would be higher than 6.3, 6.4, 6.5, 6.6, because we're getting this big number, this 5. So when Jerome Powell talks about the labor market and how it's driving things, and there's a fear of a wage price spiral. A wage price spiral exists when wages go up, so companies have to charge more money for their goods because they're paying higher wages. And because they're charging more money for their goods, people come back to them and say, hey, I can't afford to live. And so the wages go up again. And the wages go up and the prices go up again. That's a spiral. We don't want a wage price spiral. There's no evidence of a wage price spiral because wages are falling. Sorry, the growth rate of wages is falling. Wages are not falling. Is 5% still too high? Yeah, I mean, historically, yes, it is. It should be around 3. That's too high. I didn't say that. I didn't say problem solved. But the idea that there's almost no evidence that inflation has peaked, to me, doesn't comport. So I said wage inflation is a function of, I actually add jobs created, job openings, jobs created, or workers available. Job openings are going down, jobs created are going down, workers available are going up. And ultimately, all of that is derivative data. Just look at wage inflation, right? So wage inflation over 1 year and over 10 years. Is this number not still elevated over what we considered equilibrium? Yeah, of course it is. Is there evidence that it's peaked? Or how about this? Is there no evidence that it's peaked? That it hasn't peaked? No, I don't know. That doesn't really comport. There are other costs: trucking, shipping, gasoline, ISM. I'll talk about that. Used cars, Zillow. Here it is, just all in one chart. Doesn't matter. Don't worry about the colors. Trust me, all those 6 things are on this chart. I don't know, it doesn't comport. There's no evidence that these things have peaked. I don't know. I don't see that. We're now up to 15 things that could be measured as inflation. I don't know. I don't see that. We can just look at shipping and used cars. This is the cost for a container from Shanghai to Los Angeles. It's 76% off the highs. This is actually considered a busy season. When we get to December, when I speak to the CEO of Freightwaves, you can follow him on Twitter, Craig Fuller. He actually says, based on this, 2000 is very likely by December of this year, so 2 months. So now we're not just looking at elements where there's disinflation, where it's going up slower, or kind of a rolling over for deflation. This is an absolute massacre of prices, from 12,000 to 3,000 on its way to 2,000. This is a massacre. Okay. Used cars, I don't know if you guys remember in April, used cars with a used car inflation was the single largest portion of CPI. Okay, well, here's the Manheim used car index. Here, I'm going to blow it up for you. I mean, this is normal. Are we normal? No, I didn't say it was normal. But are you telling me there's no evidence that it's peaked? No, I don't see that. I don't see that there's an evidence that it's peaked. By the way, this drop from August to September was the largest drop prior to the largest drop from July to August. So it's accelerating. It's accelerating. There's something called the United States ISM Purchasing Managers Index, the PMI. So I'm just going to read you the definition, and I did it in 3 bullets, but I won't read it fully, just so because I don't want to say PMI, and I don't know what that means. Okay. So the manufacturing ISM report on businesses is based on data compiled from purchasing and supply executives nationwide. Okay, they go to purchasing, supply, and executives nationwide. This is generally on the supply side, right? Like this would be like in the PPI. So survey respondents reflect on a change, if any, in a few things. New orders on the supply side, the backlog, exports, imports, production, supplier deliveries, inventories, consumer inventories, employment, and prices. So the whole kit and caboodle. This is the PMI over the last 2 years, 10 years. This is all of those things I just told you sucked into one index. No evidence, almost no evidence that we've seen peak inflation. I don't understand that. If you're curious why PMI matters, we have a community member at CML Pro. He goes by the handle is, I'm not going to share his real name, IZ. And he shared this chart. In red is PMI. Is ISM, it's PMI, whatever, with a 3-month lead. And red is CPI. So this is this, and it generally leads to the exact same thing with inflation. And by the way, this has happened with inflation, right? It's already kind of cresting. Almost no evidence that inflation has peaked. I don't know about that. So in my opinion, this is toxic gaslighting from the Fed. Toxic gaslighting. It's combative. And I'm not talking about it's irrespective of the actual actions the Fed is taking. I'm not saying I have a problem with what the Fed is doing. I'm not arguing that. I'm not arguing that at all. There's no part of this webinar that will talk about Fed actions other than just tell you what they were. I'm talking about the messaging. And this is why it matters. Not because I thought, gosh, I can really make this webinar more lively if I do this. No, this is why it matters. And this is why it matters perhaps more than anything else in the world other than a world war. This is why I think it matters perhaps more than anything else in the world other than a world war. I am not making a comment about the Fed's policy. I am not making a comment about the Fed's policy. I am making a comment on the Fed's messaging of its policy. So here's one message, and this is the message the Fed is giving. There is little to no evidence, that's a quote, that inflation is getting better. And then here's the policy. So here's our policy. We will have to stay in this course for a prolonged period of time to cure inflation, and there will be some pain. The message, and then the policy. Here's another message, a better message. There is some evidence that inflation is getting better, but the identical policy, that's word for word, copy and paste, guys. We will have to stay in this course for a prolonged period of time to cure inflation, and there may be some pain. I changed this. There is little to no evidence that inflation is getting better to there is some evidence that inflation is getting better. I have not made a comment on the Fed's policy. This is the same policy with different messaging. Now you say, why does it matter that you, Ophir, think this message is toxic, gaslighting, and combative? Why did you just say that other than a world war, this might be the single most important thing in the world? It's because of the impact. A message of hopelessness encourages fiscal stimulus. Just look at the United Kingdom, tax cuts, California, now sending checks out again already. Okay. If the reasoning for politicians is if it's not working anyway, right? Because if the message is there's no evidence it's working. Well, if it's not working anyway, then let's help families afford life and send them money. I mean, it doesn't matter because what the Fed is doing is not working. So let's help families pay for food. That's what a message of hopelessness brings. Message one encourages action and discourages patience. You cannot be patient when someone tells you you are suffering and the suffering is not getting better. It doesn't matter what it is, prices, health, relationships. If someone tells you things are bad, we're doing bad things to make it painful, and we see no reason for it to improve, that encourages action rather than patience. Do you understand the difference? Message two is a message of hope and encourages patience. Message one discourages patience. Message two encourages patience. It's the same policy. Do the same things. If you, as the Fed, as the mouthpiece for the world economy, does not message patience, the whole fucking thing is going to break. The whole fucking thing is going to break. It's not because of policy. It's because it discourages patience, which means it encourages action. And the action that is taken is fiscal, and fiscal stimulus creates more inflation. When they say there is little to no evidence that inflation is getting better, so policy. When they could say there is evidence it's getting better with the same policy, message two strengthens the resolve for the system, for the lenders, for consumers, for producers. It strengthens the resolve. I can go through this pain. because it's getting better. And I know it's going to take a long time. And I know there's going to be more pain, but there is a value to my pain. It's getting better. There's a light at the end of the tunnel. I'm going to be patient. And in that patience, I will find resolve and strength. When they say there is some evidence that inflation is getting better, but same policy. Hey, this is going to suck. Don't look for next quarter. Don't look for next month. Stop it. Year, long time, long time. Rates going higher, big time, big higher, big numbers. Same dot plot, same policy. The policy is the same. The messaging is different. And what do we need right now? Right now, what does the world need? What does the world need? What do people in the United States need? What do you need personally on a webinar about your stocks? What do you need right now? You need resolve. The Fed is failing at providing resolve. The Fed is discouraging resolve and encouraging an action to counter it. This is toxic gaslighting. It's combative, and it doesn't even have to do with their actions. The Fed wants to break everything. Wages, jobs, home prices, the market, your savings, they're coming for all of it. It's still okay. But you take all of that and you put a message of hopelessness rather than patience, it's not gonna work. That's my opinion. And just to be clear, hope for hope's sake is completely reckless, right? That's what Russia's doing in Ukraine. It's reckless to have hope for hope's sake. I did not say just be hopeful. I showed you CPI, PPI, PCE, core CPI, core PCE, core PPI, job openings, job cuts, wage inflation, shipping, trucking, homes, car prices. Not to offer hope when there should be is gaslighting. And it's gaslighting because it's a lie. Because this statement is a lie. There is some evidence, not almost no, there is some evidence that inflation has peaked. That doesn't mean inflation has peaked. That's not what I said. There is some evidence that inflation has peaked. Some. You could even say some weak evidence. To say that there is almost no evidence that inflation has peaked is a lie. It is gaslighting. And I believe if the Federal Reserve continues messaging this, not the policy, they continue messaging this, they're going to break the system. They're not going to be able to carry through what they actually want to do. And we're starting to see the cracks in the UK and California. And they're going to make inflation worse. Their goal is to bring it down, and they're going to break it. High yield credit spreads are starting to get larger and larger very quickly. That would introduce a credit contagion. And you can go back to my prior webinar when I talked about something called a Hawkes process. Remember, I talked about a shock cluster. That is what a contagion is. And credit contagions are the most common. The Fed is going to undermine itself unless they can encourage patience by telling the truth. It's not good enough. But there's some evidence it's getting better. It's not good enough. Some evidence. There's a reason to be patient. This statement gives me no reason to be patient as a consumer. This has me knocking on the door of my local representative and saying, send me a check to pay for my bread. I can't afford food. Now, there's no evidence that it's working. Look, the Fed just said there's no evidence. The people in charge are telling me there's no evidence it's going to get better. I need money. Well, what if the message was, hey, there's some evidence it's getting better. Boy, is it slow, guys. This is going to be painful. Whew. This is going to be painful. There's some evidence. You know what I do? I say, yeah, I'm going to hold off on that trip to my representative just for 1 second. I mean, they did say it's getting better.